The 19th century, a time of unprecedented change. The British Empire spanned the globe. The sun never set on British soil. This was the age of empire. European nations pursued power in distant lands. Asia, with its wealth and civilization, stood out. The East promised riches and strategic advantage. Colonization was complex and often brutal. The encounter shaped nations and lives for generations. To understand colonialism's impact, we must look at Asia before European powers arrived. Asia was a tapestry of cultures, religions, and political systems. Powerful empires and sophisticated trade networks thrived. India boasted magnificent Mughal architecture and a flourishing textile industry. China was a global trade center renowned for porcelain, silk, and tea. Southeast Asia's spice trade attracted merchants from across the Indian Ocean. Asia was not a utopia. Internal conflicts and power struggles existed. Yet there was a balance of power and a rich cultural tapestry. What drove the Europeans to these distant shores? What were the motivations behind this era of imperial expansion? The answer, like most things in history, is complex and multifaceted. Economic gain undoubtedly played a central role. Europe's industries, fueled by the Industrial Revolution, craved raw materials and new markets for their manufactured goods. Asia, with its abundance of resources such as tea, spices, cotton and opium, offered a tantalizing prospect. The prospect of controlling trade routes, securing access to these valuable commodities, and exploiting cheap labor proved irresistible to European powers. But economic motives alone do not fully explain the zeal with which European nations carved up the Asian continent. There was also a potent mix of national rivalry, strategic considerations, and a sense of cultural and racial superiority.
India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. It's hard to overstate the impact Britain had on this vast subcontinent. Starting as humble traders with the East India Company, the British gradually gained control over vast swathes of the Indian subcontinent. By the mid-19th century, the British had established the Raj. This wasn't just about economic exploitation. The British transformed India's administration, infrastructure, and social fabric. They built railways, canals, and established universities. English education fostered a new intellectual elite that would later challenge colonial rule. Love it or loathe it, the British Raj had a profound and lasting impact on India.
Section 2, Beyond the Suez, French Indochina, a different approach. While the British were busy consolidating their hold over India, the French, not to be outdone, were carving out their own empire in Southeast Asia. French Indochina, as it came to be known, encompassed Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The French approach to colonization differed somewhat from that of the British. While economic exploitation was certainly a factor, the French also placed a great emphasis on cultural assimilation. They sought to create a class of westernized elites, promoting French language and culture. They invested in infrastructure projects, particularly in Vietnam, building roads, railways, and grand colonial cities like Hanoi and Saigon. However, French rule was not without its critics. The forced cultivation of cash crops like rubber and rice often came at the expense of food security for the local population. Land alienation and the exploitation of plantation workers led to widespread resentment. The French legacy in Indochina, like that of the British in India, is a complex and contested one, marked by both progress and exploitation. Section 3, Spice and Sorrow, the Dutch East Indies, a study in exploitation. Moving further east, we encounter the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia. The Dutch, arriving in the late 16th century, were drawn by the lucrative spice trade. The Dutch East India Company established a monopoly, ruthlessly exploiting Indonesian resources and labor. The culture system led to widespread hardship and famine among the Indonesian population. The legacy of Dutch colonialism in Indonesia is marked by centuries of exploitation and cultural suppression. Section 4, trading places, coastal enclaves and the power of commerce. While the British, French and Dutch were busy establishing vast land empires, other European powers like the Portuguese and the Spanish adopted a different approach. They established trading posts in coastal enclaves, leveraging their naval power to control strategic trade routes and secure access to valuable commodities. The Portuguese, arriving in the 16th century, established a string of trading posts along the coasts of India, China and Southeast Asia. They controlled the spice trade for a time, but were eventually eclipsed by the Dutch and the British. The Spanish, meanwhile, established a colony in the Philippines, using it as a base for trade with China and the Americas. The impact of these trading empires, while less territorially expansive, was nonetheless significant. They introduced new goods, ideas and technologies, influencing local economies and cultures. The port cities of Asia became melting pots of different cultures and ethnicities, shaping the social fabric of the region. Section 5, the uneasy dance, collaboration, resistance, and the seeds of change. The story of colonialism in Asia is not simply a tale of Western domination and Asian subjugation. It's a far more nuanced and complex narrative, one that involves collaboration, resistance, and adaptation on both sides. While some local elites collaborated with colonial powers, benefiting from the new order, others resisted, often through armed struggle or passive resistance. The imposition of foreign rule ignited a sense of nationalism and a yearning for self-determination among the colonized populations. From the Sepoy Mutiny in India to the Boxer Rebellion in China, resistance to colonial rule took various forms. These movements, though often brutally suppressed, sowed the seeds for future independence struggles. The encounter between the West and the East also led to a complex interplay of cultural influences. Western ideas about education, law and governance found their way into Asian societies, while Asian art, philosophy and religion influenced European thought. This cross-cultural exchange, though often unequal and fraught with tension, left a lasting legacy on both sides. Section 1. The riches of the East. Exploiting resources for imperial gain. Let's be frank, resource exploitation was central to colonialism. Asia's natural wealth was a treasure trove for Europe. Spices, tea, rubber, cotton, these fueled European industries. The modus operandi was simple: secure land through dubious treaties or force, use forced labor, exploit power structures, ship raw materials to Europe for profit. This model impacted Asian economies profoundly. Colonizers amassed wealth, locals saw little benefit, resources for local development were siphoned off, leaving underdevelopment. Plantation economies and the rise of monoculture. Colonialism transformed economies with plantation agriculture. Vast lands were converted to cash crops like tea, coffee and rubber. This shift to monoculture had far-reaching consequences. It created industries and jobs, often under exploitative conditions. Economies became dependent on single commodities, vulnerable to price changes. This often compromised food security. Plantation economies relied on cheap labor, displacing local populations. Section 3. The Iron Horse and the steamship infrastructure and the uneven march of progress. Colonialism brought infrastructural development in Asia. Railways, roads, ports and communication lines were built to extract resources and move goods. The British built an extensive railway network across India, the lifeline of the empire. These projects connected regions but often had uneven impacts. Section 4. Winners and losers, the disruption of traditional industries and the emergence of new elites. The arrival of European powers disrupted traditional Asian economies, leading to both winners and losers. The influx of cheap manufactured goods from Europe, often aided by unfair trade practices, decimated local industries such as textiles in India and Southeast Asia. Artisans and craftspeople, once the backbone of these industries, found themselves outcompeted and impoverished. However, colonialism also created new opportunities for some. A new class of Asian intermediaries emerged, profiting from their connections to the colonial administration and their role in facilitating trade. Some local entrepreneurs, often from minority communities, were quick to adapt to the new economic realities, establishing businesses that catered to the needs of the colonial market. The rise of these new elites, while contributing to economic growth in some instances, also exacerbated social inequalities. The gap between the haves and the have-nots widened, laying the groundwork for future social tensions. Section 5, Seeds of Change, colonialism's mixed legacy of economic development. The economic legacy of colonialism in Asia is a complex and contested one. On the one hand, colonialism led to the exploitation of resources, the underdevelopment of local industries, and the creation of economies dependent on cash crops. On the other hand, it also introduced new technologies, infrastructure, and systems of governance, laying the groundwork for future economic growth in some instances. Some argue that the economic structures put in place during the colonial era, while exploitative in nature, provided the foundation for the rapid economic growth experienced by some Asian countries in the post-colonial era. Others contend that colonialism created lasting structural imbalances that continue to hinder development in many parts of the region. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. Colonialism's economic impact on Asia was a mixed bag, leaving behind a legacy of both progress and exploitation, opportunity and inequality. Section 6. Beyond the balance sheet, the enduring impact of economic exploitation. While the economic indicators might paint a complex picture, one cannot ignore the human cost of colonial exploitation. Generations of Asians were forced to toil on plantations, in mines, and on infrastructure projects, often under inhumane conditions. The wealth extracted from Asia fueled European industrialization and prosperity, while many parts of the colonized world remained mired in poverty. The scars of exploitation run deep. The psychological impact of economic subjugation, the loss of dignity, the erosion of self-sufficiency, the feeling of being left behind, is harder to quantify but no less real. The legacy of this exploitation continues to cast a long shadow on Asia, shaping perceptions of the West, fueling nationalist sentiments and influencing economic policies even today. Section 1, Shifting Sands, Social Structures in Flux. The intrusion of Western powers into Asian societies had a seismic impact on existing social structures. Traditional hierarchies, often based on caste, religion, or land ownership, were challenged and altered. The British codified the caste system in India, inadvertently reinforcing its rigidity. The rise of new economic elites, often from communities favored by the colonial administration, further complicated the social landscape.
Similar disruptions occurred in other parts of Asia. In Southeast Asia, the influx of Chinese migrants, encouraged by colonial powers, led to new ethnic tensions.
Section 2, the Empire's curriculum, education as a tool of transformation and control. European powers established schools and universities that promoted Western values and ideologies. The curriculum emphasized European history, literature, and science, often at the expense of local knowledge systems.
The unintended consequence was the emergence of intellectuals who later challenged colonial rule. Exposure to Western ideas ignited nationalism among Asian students, questioning the legitimacy of foreign rule.
Section 3, a clash of faiths, religious conversion and cultural resistance. European colonialism in Asia was intertwined with missionary zeal to spread Christianity. While some embraced the new faith, many others resisted, clinging to their traditional beliefs. In some cases, it led to the growth of Christianity. In others, it sparked religious revival movements. The legacy of this religious encounter is complex, seen as both forced conversion and cultural exchange. Section 4, the rise of the interpreters. Language, identity, and the emergence of new elites. The imposition of European languages had a profound impact on linguistic landscapes and cultural identities in Asia. Fluency in the colonizer's tongue became a marker of social mobility and access to power. A new class of bilingual elites emerged, serving as intermediaries and cultural brokers. This linguistic divide created new social hierarchies, with those fluent in the colonizer's language enjoying greater opportunities. Traditional languages and forms of knowledge were marginalized. The challenge for post-colonial societies has been to reclaim their linguistic heritage while recognizing the role of global languages. Section 5. East meets West, cultural fusion, hybridity, and the reinvention of tradition. The encounter between Asia and the West led to a complex interplay of cultural influences. Asian artists, writers, and musicians began to experiment, incorporating Western influences into their own traditions. This led to new genres and styles, such as the fusion of traditional ragas with Western musical instruments in India. Colonial cities showcased a blend of architectural styles, creating a unique heritage. This process of cultural hybridity was seen by some as cultural appropriation and by others as a natural evolution of culture. Section 6. Scars on the Soul, the enduring legacy of social and cultural disruption. The experience of colonization left a legacy of psychological trauma that continues to shape perceptions and identities. The loss of agency and internalization of colonial stereotypes have proven difficult to heal. The challenge for post-colonial societies has been to deconstruct colonial narratives and reclaim a sense of self-worth rooted in their own cultures. Section 1. The Old Order fades, traditional power structures under pressure. The arrival of European powers disrupted trade routes and economic systems, shaking political power. Asia was a patchwork of empires, kingdoms, sultanates, and princely states, each with unique governance systems. The Europeans sought to dismantle or co-opt these existing power structures. They employed tactics from military conquest to subtle manipulation, eroding the legitimacy of traditional rulers. Section 2. Divide and Rule. The Colonial Playbook and its lasting consequences. Colonial powers exploited the diversity of Asian societies to consolidate their own power. By playing one group against another, they maintained control with minimal military presence. New administrative boundaries ignored historical ties, sowing seeds of future conflicts. The legacy of divide and rule policies continues to haunt post-colonial nations, fueling ethnic conflicts and political instability. Section 3. The Seeds of Dissent, Nationalism, and the Rise of Anti-Colonial Movements. The imposition of foreign rule ignited a spark of resistance that grew into organized political movements. Nationalist leaders, educated in Western institutions, recognized the injustice of colonial rule. They drew inspiration from their own cultural traditions, articulating a vision for an independent future. These movements eventually led to the end of the colonial rule in many parts of Asia. Section 4. The Long Road to Freedom, Paths to Independence Across Asia. The road to independence was long and arduous, shaped by local contexts and nationalist strategies. Gandhi's nonviolent resistance in India, armed struggle in Indonesia, and guerrilla warfare in Vietnam led to freedom. The end of World War II marked a turning point, weakening European powers and emboldening nationalist movements. By the mid-20th century, most of Asia had achieved independence. This ushered in a new era of hope and uncertainty. Section 5. The Colonial Hangover, the challenges of building stable and just societies. Independence did not instantly erase the legacies of colonialism. Newly independent nations faced the task of building stable societies from the ruins of empire. Ethnic and religious divisions, exacerbated by colonial policies, erupted into violence. The journey ahead was fraught with obstacles, but there was also hope and optimism. ghosts of empire colonial legacies in modern Asia. The ghost of empire lingers over Asia in grand colonial buildings amidst modern cities. Legal systems modeled after former rulers continue to shape justice. Economic and social disparities follow the fault lines of colonial exploitation. The legacies seen in railways, plantation economies, and subtle nuances of language. It's a complex inheritance woven from threads of progress and exploitation. The power of the past. How colonialism still shapes Asian politics. The arbitrary borders drawn by European powers have left a legacy of territorial disputes and political instability. The partition of India and Pakistan continues to cast a long shadow. Competing territorial claims in the South China Sea are based on colonial-era maps. The legacy of colonialism is evident in the often unequal relationships between former colonial powers and their former colonies. Winners and losers, economic inequality, and the long shadow of exploitation. Economic disparities in Asia are a direct consequence of colonial exploitation. The systematic extraction of resources and underdevelopment of local industries left a lasting legacy. While some nations have achieved economic growth, prosperity has often been unevenly distributed. Addressing these economic disparities is crucial for achieving lasting peace and prosperity in Asia. Section 4, Lost in Translation, Language, Culture and the Search for Identity. The linguistic and cultural landscapes of Asia have been irrevocably altered by colonialism. The imposition of European languages, while facilitating communication and trade, also led to the marginalization of indigenous languages and knowledge systems. In many former colonies, English or French continues to be the language of government, education and commerce. A legacy that has both advantages and disadvantages. While proficiency in these global languages can open doors to economic opportunities and international engagement, it can also create a linguistic divide, privileging certain segments of society over others. The challenge for many post-colonial societies has been to reclaim their linguistic and cultural heritage while also navigating the realities of globalization. It's a delicate balancing act, preserving tradition while embracing modernity, forging a new sense of identity from the fragments of a colonized past. It's easy to fall into the trap of viewing the legacy of colonialism in binary terms, good versus bad, progress versus exploitation. But the reality, as always, is far more nuanced and complex. Colonialism left an indelible mark on Asia, shaping its political, economic and social landscapes in profound ways. It's essential to acknowledge the injustices of the past, to understand how the legacies of colonialism continue to shape the present. But it's equally important to move beyond a simplistic narrative of victimhood and blame. The challenge for Asia in the 21st century is to reclaim its own narrative, to tell its own stories on its own terms. It's about recognizing the agency and resilience of Asian societies, their ability to adapt, innovate and forge their own paths to progress. The future of Asia, a continent brimming with potential and possibility, lies not in dwelling on the past, but in learning from it, in forging a new future based on the principles of equality, justice and mutual respect. Section 1, A Tapestry of Contradictions, the Mixed Legacy of Colonialism in Asia. As we've journeyed across the vast expanse of Asia, exploring the multifaceted impact of colonialism, one thing becomes abundantly clear. There are no easy answers, no simple pronouncements. The legacy of empire is a tapestry woven from threads of progress and exploitation, opportunity and inequality, cultural exchange and social disruption. We've seen how the thirst for resources and the pursuit of power led to the subjugation of entire populations, the dismantling of traditional power structures, and the imposition of foreign rule. Yet we have also witnessed the emergence of new ideas, the spread of education, the building of infrastructure, and the rise of nationalist movements that ultimately led to independence. To judge this era solely through the lens of economic indicators or political structures would be to miss the human story at its heart. The psychological scars of colonialism, the enduring sense of loss, the struggle to reclaim agency and identity, these are legacies that continue to shape perceptions and influence policies even today. Asia's century and the lessons of history. As Asia takes center stage in the 21st century, it does so with the weight of history on its shoulders. The lessons learned from this tumultuous past can serve as guideposts for the journey ahead. The challenge is to harness the region's dynamism while addressing colonial legacies. It's about building inclusive societies where economic growth benefits all, learning from past mistakes to create a more just future. Understanding the past equips us to build a better future.